which is coming out in 2015. He is a former senior official in the Mossad and former director of the Jaffee Center for Strategic Studies. In 2000, during the Camp David talks, he was a special advisor to the Prime Minister of Israel. Between 2000 and 2012, he co-edited with Qassam Khatib the Bitter Lemons family of internet publication, a superb publication. Aaron David Miller is the vice president for the new initiatives and a distinguished scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center. For 2 decades, he served as an advisor to Republican and Democratic Secretary of States, helping formulate U.S. policy on the Middle East and the Arab-Israeli peace process. Aaron is the author of 5 books, including his recent book, which came out almost only 2 weeks ago, The End of Greatness, Why America Can't Have and Doesn't Want Another Great President. He decided that he will take a break from the Middle East and write this book. It's a superb book. I recommend it to all of you. I would also like to welcome Jane Harman, the director, CEO, and president of the Wilson Center, and it's always a pleasure to have her attend the Middle East meetings. The format today is going to be a conversation, and a very interesting conversation, as Aaron explained to me. So Aaron, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, and thank all of you for coming. Joe, it's terrific to see you, Jane as well. And Yossi, it's an honor to be here with you. I've known you for a very long time, and understanding the world, I would argue, is critically important to fixing it, which means that a cruel and unforgiving analysis of the way the world is really important, and it is the point of departure in order to have any hope of fashioning the world the way we want it to be. So I want to thank you for coming. You are indeed one of Israel's foremost political analysts and an expert on national security affairs. I want to apologize to all of you, however, also for willfully misrepresenting who is here today. This is not Yossi Alpher, and I am not Aaron David Miller. For the next 30 minutes, the gentleman to my left is the outgoing director of Israel's Mossad.
Finally.
I could extend your tenure if you want, Mr. Director, and I am the Prime Minister of Israel. And we're going to have a conversation between the current Prime Minister and the outgoing director of Mossad on the subject at hand. I think it'll help focus the conversation. That'll last roughly till 1:30 or so, and then we will go to your questions. First, Mr. Director, I want to thank you for your distinguished service. It's been 3 to 4 years now. You've provided the State of Israel and Prime Minister with terrific advice. You're now outgoing, and I want to offer you an opportunity to speak honestly, forthrightly, and directly about the core challenges that that's now facing Israel's security. I'd like you to identify for me, if you would, the 3 most important challenges that I should be worrying about, based on your long experience and your honesty and clarity in these many years in presenting your recommendations to me. So that'll be the first part of the conversation, and then we'll turn to the issue of your recommendations, freed from politics, your personal relationship with me, and any other consideration. So, Mr. Director.
Well, thank you very much. Jane, you need some help from our technical people? First of all, Prime Minister, it's been an honor to serve you. Thank you for asking me to express myself frankly, but we both know that, that our setup works in such a way that I've always expressed myself frankly. and it's always remained in this room so that I felt free to do that. So you're going to hear something more in the lines of a summary of things we've talked about in the past. But I'd like to think that we always had this kind of frank discussion. You asked me to talk about 3 issues, but let me, and we, as you know, we always like to divide everything into 3 issues, but I'm going to divide it into more or less 3 and 3. Because what I'd like to suggest is, in terms of what should keep you awake at night, or what you should think about when you wake up in a cold sweat at 3 in the morning, and I know this happens to you, are both the urgent and the important. They're, of course, interrelated. But in my thinking, it's very helpful to try to separate the urgent from the important. So what's most urgent in terms of Israel's immediate security needs? First of all, I would say the Iranian threat. And of course, this is not new to you. You spoke about this just recently at the United Nations. And the Iranian threat means not only the nuclear issue, meaning what will happen by November 24th, and how will Israel be able to live with that, if we can live with it? Not only Israel, but our neighbors as well, with whom our cooperation is improving. But also the Iranian hegemonic threat in the Levant. And here we're looking at Hezbollah right across the border, at Iran in Syria, at Iran in Iraq. We're even looking at Iran in Yemen, with the Houthis at Bab el-Mandeb, which is, I think, an issue that I would commend to you and to my successor to pay growing attention to. Secondly, again, urgent, the terrorist Islamist threat, whether it's Hamas renewing the war from Gaza, whether it's Hezbollah, who just sent us a reminder that they may be busy in Syria and Iraq, but they haven't forgotten us, and you can be certain this links up with the Iranian threat as well. Also the Daesh, ISIS, ISIL, IS threat, I'll call it Daesh, because it threatens to reach very close to us, to Jordan's borders, into Lebanon, and here and there, as my colleague from the Shin Bet will confirm, there are some manifestations of support for Daesh among the Arab citizens of Israel. And thirdly, I would cite, in terms of urgency, maintaining the growing strategic cooperation that has emerged in the course of the last few years with Egypt and Jordan. To a lesser extent, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, whom you mentioned in your UN speech, and we made sure that they didn't object to that. You heard no objections. But this is a key element. This is perhaps the only ray of light that has emerged from our standpoint in the atmosphere of the Arab Spring and the rise of militant Islam throughout the Middle East. And these relationships have to be nurtured. And that means a lobbying on behalf of President Sisi in Washington. It means listening to King Abdullah and what his needs are, and trying to accommodate them, even on the Palestinian issue or on issues like the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, where by treaty he has a certain degree of jurisdiction. These relationships have to be nurtured. And I'm particularly concerned with the rise inside Jordan of a pro-ISIS Islamist threat. Not to say that Sisi doesn't have his hands and his jails full of Islamists, but he seems to be much more in control and much more able to control than the kinds of things the king can do, but also the threat on his borders. ISIS on the Jordanian-Iraqi border, or what was the Jordanian-Iraqi border, and Jabhat al-Nusra and others on the Jordanian-Syrian border. So these, looking around our borders and further afield, these are the most urgent security issues on the agenda as I understand them.
Mr. Director, let me ask you a few questions. What do your sources have to tell us on prospects for an agreement by November 24th? What are your own personal views as to whether or not, comprehensive agreement, extension, a framework agreement, a breakdown amidst recrimination? What do you think might be the most likely outcome?
Well, you know, this is very much a political issue that involves your relationship with President Obama.
Indeed.
And I'm not sure how much I can enlighten you. My own overall sense is we're not looking at a crisis. November 25th will not present us with some insurmountable, sensational crisis that requires you to sit down and make immediate decisions. You may like it, you may not like it. We all may like it or not like it. We'll probably not like it. But there'll be some continuation after that. So I would downplay the significance of the November 24th deadline based on what we know now. And of course, you have to factor in a lot of other things here that we don't have control over. For example, U.S.-Iran relations in the Iran-Daesh context. Or what happens on other fronts like Syria and Lebanon, or our potential for confrontation with Hezbollah. All can get folded into this. But my broad sense is this will not require any immediate dramatic decision. Response, yes, obviously, but not decision.
Can I ask you a specific question on the Golan? You know that recently we've given permission for Israelis for the first time to begin drilling for oil.
On the Golan?
On the Golan. Now, if you could create a frame of reference for me about how things are likely to play out. There's a Druze factor, there's a Jabhat al-Nusra factor. We're treating hundreds of Syrian civilians and even combatants who ask for our medical attention. Well, does this suggest to you that the margin for our continued occupation or possession, administrative jurisdiction over the Golan Heights is likely to continue?
Absolutely. Unlike the situation since 1967, no one today can grab us by the collar and say, hey, this guy who is in authority wants to talk to you about the Golan within the framework of an Israeli-Syrian peace agreement. It doesn't exist. We don't know what's going to happen. It's conceivable that 10 years from now, a victorious Bashar al-Assad will show up once again at the negotiating table. But in the current realities in the Middle East, and this is why I recommended that you allow the oil drilling for the first time since '67, this is not on the horizon. And the more time goes by, the more likely it is that whatever emerges across the border in Syria will not put the Golan at the top of its agenda or anywhere near the top of its agenda, because we're looking at mayhem in the Levant for many years to come. And as you know, in our intelligence community, we've set up new structures to try to identify who's who across the border and whether we can work with them or not. And here I have to permit me, as a parting gesture, to commend your approach to the chaos across our borders and the parties involved, because we really have managed to stay uninvolved. Mm-hmm. And not only to stay uninvolved, but to prevent a situation in which one party points and says, you're supporting the other party. Assad tried it for a while, and it didn't work. You don't hear this anymore. They understand we're not involved. So that we're continuing to do the minimum, which is to look for people to talk to across the border, anybody, who will keep a quiet border and who will avoid a situation in which we even have to think about possibly sending troops across the border to create some sort of buffer zone between us and some ugly and nasty people. And here we're working closely with the Jordanians, and here I would say is one area I emphasize, where we've been able to work fairly well with the Americans as well.
I appreciate that. One final question before you move on to your important issues. To what degree have the mistakes of our American friends with respect to Egypt and Saudi Arabia? Egypt on pushing human rights as the determinative issue in the relationship, and with the Saudis, their determination to reach an agreement with the Iranians, generated closer relations, explicitly in the case of Egypt, and perhaps implicitly in the case of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf.
Well, with Egypt to a fairly high degree, and here no one hides the fact that we lobby on behalf of the Sisi administration in Washington, basically suggesting to the administration that it is mistaken in focusing on human rights violations in Egypt at a time when there are much more heavy issues on the agenda, and when all the alternatives for Egypt are worse, not only for Egypt, not only for American interests, but for our interests, for Saudi interests as well. And right now, you're looking at an Egypt with whom we are cooperating very closely in Sinai, cooperating very closely regarding Gaza. They're also busy on their Libyan front. So this is an area where we can talk. Even though it's rather interesting, as you know, we don't have an embassy in Cairo. They don't want us to have an embassy in Cairo. They don't, Israeli journalists still can't, despite all our efforts, can't get visas to visit Cairo. It's a strange relationship, which is why I go back to the need to cultivate it and try to expand it, and the American angle is one way. With the Saudis, I would say the U.S. involvement is to a lesser extent. After all, we have no border with them. We have no direct military cooperation with them. We have common interests regarding Iran, regarding Daesh, not regarding the Palestinian issue, broadly speaking. And whereas when we work with Egypt, we work with a country that has a long-established diplomatic service and intelligence service, a lot of depth, a lot of bench strength there. My impression from our dealings are minor dealings with the Saudis is that they don't have that kind of bench strength, and it's not quite as easy.
Yes. So it's fair to say that under my prime ministership, relations between Israel and Egypt are perhaps the best they've ever been?
They are the best, well, militarily or at the security level, the best.
Sure.
If you want to go back to Sadat's day and Israeli agricultural experts making the desert bloom in Egypt and Israel Cultural Center and thousands of tourists, no. And I don't know if we'll ever get back there. And with all due respect, sir, it's circumstances and broader developments in the Middle East that have brought this about.
Of course.
But we have played it right. I dare say we've played it right.
Okay, now moving to the important issues, Mr. Director.
All right, you already touched on one, and I already touched on one, and let me begin with that. And that is, and this is a concern we share with the Egyptians, the Jordanians, Saudis, many others in the Middle East. And that is what to do about American mistakes in the region. What to do with a United States that is seeking to detach militarily and at the security level from the region in a number of geographic spheres, that went into the fight with Daesh based on what? 2 beheadings. President who acknowledges he doesn't have a strategy. Now, we'll get to an area where I don't think you have a strategy either, sir.
I was waiting for that.
But a misbegotten peace process that never had a chance to go anywhere, and that in the eyes of some actually contributed to a deterioration in the situation that led to the war with Gaza. How do we deal with this? Now, of course, the return to the Middle East to fight Daesh, it's an open question today whether this is an aberration, a short-term exception, or a genuine reversal of some sort. But it's extremely difficult, and as I'm sure you know from your conversations with President Obama, to make sense of all of this. Not just for us, for our neighbors as well. And we saw this in the recent war with Gaza, where Secretary of State Kerry, his vision of ending the war was sitting down with Turkey and Qatar, and in a sense, excluding the Egyptians, who from a geostrategic standpoint were the only party that could conceivably bring about an outcome that we could accept. And we saw this in the mismanagement of a 9-month peace process, and we've seen it in a host of other areas as well. So this is one long-term area of concern, and it's one where we have plenty of people to consult with in the region who share our concern. That's number one. Secondly, and here I get back to our conflicts with our Islamist non-state or semi-state neighbors. You can't call Hamas a non-state neighbor anymore. It's a semi-state neighbor, perhaps. But as a long-term concern that we, again, share with many neighbors and many people, many Americans, Europeans, others, is how to fight and, if not win, at least prevail in wars, asymmetric wars with these non-state neighbors who don't play by the rules. And this summer, we saw a perfect example of that. No matter how much damage we inflicted, there was always someone in the Hamas leadership who said, no, we'll suffer in order to achieve goals that they never achieved. And because they never achieved them, we have to assume that this ceasefire is temporary.
Yes.
And when it will end, I don't know. But when it does end, we're back where we started. And here, I need to focus specifically on the asymmetric problem with the Palestinians. I'm sorry to say, you don't have a viable strategy for dealing in general with the Palestinians, where your goals are two-state solution and maintaining Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. You don't have a strategy for doing it. And we were all painfully aware this summer, when all you talked about was quiet in return for quiet, that you don't have a strategy for dealing with Hamas in Gaza. Now you're in good company. Ehud Olmert didn't have a strategy. He had a strategy, not a viable one. His strategy was to somehow count their calories and not allow food in until the Mavi Marmara incident, where you correctly reverse this. Starve them out, show them how badly off they are economically, make the West Bank prosperous, and this would change matters, as if this were an economic conflict and not a political one. Ariel Sharon had a strategy: get out. Get out and turn it over to the international community, and all we got were rockets and war after war. So it's not an easy issue, I fully recognize that. But this is something we have to deal with in a more rational way. We have to consciously sift through the strategies, and we have to recognize, and you, sir, have to recognize, that messianism is not a strategy. And there are serious partners in your coalition for whom messianism is a strategy, in the West Bank and in Jerusalem as well. So this is a long-term problem. It's been with us for many years, and I'm not suggesting your predecessors had better strategies, necessarily. But this is something we have to come to grips with. I think those are the important issues that I would point to, broadly speaking.
I really appreciate your honesty and clarity. You're leaving, and I wish you tremendous success in your future endeavors, and I may, from time to time, since I plan to be around for quite a long time to come. I may continue to consult with you, but I have
I
one...
can assure you I'm not going into politics. You don't have to worry about me.
Good to know. It's good to know. But let me ask you, let's assume, just for the sake of argument, this is a non-conversation, that on the 3 or 4 core issues that are really meaningful to the Palestinians, territory, Jerusalem, and refugees, I actually was prepared to go much further than any public intimations, and much further than I've expressed myself to John Kerry. My question for you, maybe it's a more appropriate question for the Shin Bet director. Maybe I should have you both in here together. Do you think, given the nature of the Palestinian national movement, divisions between Hamas and Fatah, and the regional environment, do you think that if I were prepared to move toward a conflict-ending agreement, that Mahmoud Abbas, and I'll concede to you, the best partner Israelis have ever had, is he prepared, can he make the kinds of decisions on these core issues that would satisfy my needs and requirements?
I would say we have to redefine the issue a little bit. And because Mahmoud Abbas, as you well know, basically since he walked away from Ehud Olmert's very far-reaching offer in September 2008, the end of the Annapolis process, has not been interested in negotiating with you. And he's now interested in going to the UN and getting recognition there. It's my sense that what he is signaling is that he understands he can't reach an end of conflict agreement with you, with Ehud Olmert, with Ehud Barak, or with anybody else on the Israeli scene. He can, not because you can't agree on borders. And if you're really prepared to be flexible on a Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem, not because you can't agree on this. And he'll be a willing partner on security issues. I'm sure of this because he understands how much, in this crazy Middle East, how dependent he is on Israel as a strong neighbor. But because he can't agree with us on the refugee right of return issue, and on that very hot issue that's in the news all day, every day now, the Temple Mount issue, or to put it differently, who owns the Temple Mount? And he knows it. My view is he knows it. Now, if he doesn't believe he can negotiate these issues with you because you make the point, which most of the Israeli public, which resonates well with the Israeli public, why should we give up the West Bank in return for something that's less than an end of conflict, that leaves these pre-1967 narrative issues open and festering? So he goes to the UN, okay? Now, the question you have to ask yourself, and here we get back to the issue of a strategy for dealing with the Palestinian issue that leaves Israel a Jewish and a democratic state. The question you have to ask yourself is, what has to be the prime Israeli interest in a deal with the Palestinians? Is it getting them to renounce their very hard-held positions on these narrative issues like the right of return and the Temple Mount? Or is it saving Israel as a Jewish and democratic state by getting it out of the West Bank with adequate security provisions? If it's the latter, I think it's possible, with American help, perhaps in the international arena, but perhaps also bilaterally, to make some progress not toward an end of conflict, but toward a two-state solution, and leave these really heavy narrative issues, some of which, like the Temple Mount, are 3,000 years old. Leave them for the future, for your, however long you intend to serve, for your successor and Abu Mazen's successor. That's the only chance I see today. And frankly, until now, you have not been oriented in this direction because you know you will open yourself to very sharp criticism from the right that you're giving up God-given territory on the West Bank in return for what? A flimsy Palestinian state and no serious concessions by them. and because some of your coalition partners value Jewish state above democratic state. So this is would be a very hard, very, very hard decision for you to make. And we can't be sure that Abu Mazen would still be a willing partner, number one. Number two, we can't be sure that, and here I come back to one of my important points, we can't be sure that the United States, in its current profile of downsizing its involvement in the Middle East, would be prepared to make the effort to make this happen. What I can tell you for sure is looking at Kerry's platform for his recent 9-month effort, and I presume it will be the same platform if he tries again, he doesn't see it this way. He is still coming into negotiate or to an attempt to reach an agreement after 20 years of Oslo trial and error and failure, without having drawn conclusions from the failures. And so he comes in with the same Oslo menu that failed at Camp David in 2000 and that failed between Olmert and Abu Mazen. I would be very happy if next time you sat him down and explained this to him. And if you want to call on me as a private citizen, I'd be happy to try to do it myself.
Thank you, Mr. Director. I am absolutely persuaded that after the midterms, sometime in 2015, that the Secretary will, in fact, make another run. And this challenge, the one you just identified, may well be the greatest challenge that I face, and I may well call upon you for your advice. But thank you so much for your service. And with plenty of time that remains, we'd like to go to your questions. Please identify yourself. Questions, please. I think there is a mic coming around. Yes.
Thank you. Is this on? Good. Okay, I'm Dave Rabinowitz. I have two quick questions. First, yesterday in this building, there was a session about the global rise of anti-Semitism, partly as a result of the Gaza war. I'm just wondering what Israel can be doing to try to counter that. And the second question is, a majority of refugees in UNRWA camps are not in the territories. They're in Lebanon, Jordan, and whatever may be left in Syria. Where do they fit in? And how do they get into a peace settlement?
Yossi.
You want me to take these one by one?
Yes.
I'm speaking as
Yossi Alpher.
Yossi Alpher. Okay.
Of course.
Well, you've pointed to two important issues that I recognize. I didn't, sticking only with the urgent and the important, I didn't mention. Global anti-Semitism was undoubtedly fueled by what happened in Gaza and will undoubtedly be fueled by any new war with anybody. That's the way we're being looked at today. There are plenty of double standards, but there's also plenty of confusion of the borderline between legitimate opposition to Israel and its policies and anti-Semitism. At the end of the day, in terms of what we can do about it, okay, at the end of the day, we have to recognize that 3 years from now will mark 50 years to the occupation of millions of Palestinians. And that's the way the world sees us and will continue to see us. Whatever the justifications are for war, for negotiations, for occupation, for whatever, longest occupation on Earth, I think, in the international community. At least it's billed that way. If we can't do something to mitigate that negative image, we're going to be very hard put to deal with this rising wave of anti-Semitism to the extent we can deal with it. And there are elements here that are clearly not in our control. Note that anti-Semitism, which seems to be most rife in Europe and on certain university campuses, is also almost monopolistic among our Arab neighbors. You want to buy a copy of the Protocols of Elders of Zion, stop at the airport in Amman. You don't have to go to the library. And certainly if you want to read the Hamas charter for a real treatment, okay? So it's not going to go away. And to the extent that militant Islam is rising, it's going to rise along with it, without a doubt, because this is part and parcel of it. The one area I would point to is that we can have an effect is the occupation. Not easy, but we should keep that in mind. 3 years from now, the world, everybody who doesn't like Israel for any reason whatsoever is going to have a circus over 50 years of occupation. So get ready for that. Refugees, UNRWA, look, in my view, and I'm hardly a hawk on the Israeli-Palestinian issues, UNRWA is a disaster. In concept, it's a disaster. There are good people in UNRWA. They need the money. They have schools, they have clinics, they educate Palestinians wherever they are, 5 million Palestinians. But the concept is a disaster because the concept keeps the conflict alive wherever UNRWA exists and wherever UNRWA camps and perpetual refugees exist. I mean, I speak as, I'm the son of a refugee, okay? My mother was a refugee 100 years ago in fleeing Galicia to Vienna in World War I, okay? Imagine a few years from now, not long from now, you're going to have not 5 million, but 6 or 7 or 8 million Palestinians, third, fourth, fifth, sixth generation refugees. Do I have rights as a refugee? Absolutely nothing. They're the only ones who have rights as a refugee. So this is a disaster. Nobody's doing anything about it. And it's one reason why the whole right of return issue is so totally intractable. Abu Mazen, I don't know if you followed this a year or so ago, he was interviewed on Israel Channel 2 TV. And he said very magnanimously to the Israeli public, he said, I give up the right of return to Tzfat, Safed, where he was born in Upper Galilee. I give it up. Wow, everybody said Abu Mazen gave up the right of return. The next day came the clarification. Of course, I don't speak for 5 million other refugees, but I'm an old man and I understand I'm not going back and so on and so forth. I mean, the more we've tried to come to terms in negotiating on this issue, not on the number of refugees who might return, and Aaron has direct experience with dealing with it, 10,000, 100,000, the Clinton parameters, so on and so forth, but on the Palestinian demand that Israel accept their right to return, which means accept that the state of Israel was born in sin. And on this basis, we're going to build a healthy relationship. The closer we've gotten to that, the more it's been obvious that we're nowhere near solving this issue. Now, UNRWA is not I mean, I don't know if it's the cause or the effect. I don't think it necessarily prevents agreement or prevents an agreement to set this issue aside for a while. But it's certainly the concept of UNRWA is extremely problematic. And yet at the same time, I remember going back to the Six-Day War in '67 when I was a lowly first lieutenant in IDF intelligence. And I remember we were all saying, oh, we can dismantle UNRWA. Now we can get into those camps in Gaza and the West Bank and dismantle UNRWA. And we got into the camps and realized, wait a minute, we're going to take on this burden? We're going to take on these schools and these clinics and their multi-million-dollar annual budget and so on and so forth? No, they fulfill a very useful purpose under circumstances of conflict and no resolution of the issue. So it's very complex. It has to be addressed, and it isn't being addressed.
Thank you. Jane.
Yossi, it's always good to have you here. Welcome back.
Jane, we last met at the Dead Sea, Jordan.
At one of those WEF conferences? Where did we? I don't know. We've met a number of times. Been there for that.
Economic conferences.
Yeah. World Economic Forum conferences. Okay. and it, if you become Mossad director, that's fine with me. Thought I'd mention that.
Duly noted.
Duly noted. I'm the daughter of a refugee, too, from Nazi Germany. He left in 1935 and was lucky to find a sponsor here. And you make a valid point that there are lots of kinds of refugees, not only Palestinian refugees. But I want to talk about your comments about the U.S. role in the Middle East. And you said it was downsizing. If President Obama were here, I think he would not say that. I think he would say he has been trying to end two very unpopular wars where we had strategies that were not successful, but not to downsize the role, to change the role. And I think the intervention in the Daesh-ISIL issue is a changed role. It is an attempt to confront a new challenge that is different from prior efforts by terror groups, etc. Anyway, I just want to make that claim. You may disagree with it. But a big part of the action against ISIL has to include an effective counter-narrative, not just kinetic action. I mean, we're seeing that can only go so far. And that's what I want to ask you about. You said that supporting Egypt's current government, which is an authoritarian government, probably more harsh than the Mubarak government ever was, is in Israel's interest because of the things Egypt's able to deliver. My question is, if the U.S. supports Egypt's government and the transition in other countries to much tougher authoritarian, although secular rule, is that going to generate a counter-narrative in the region that will be helpful to defeat the kind of threat that ISIL is? And I would argue ISIL ultimately, even though you're staying out of it, could ultimately be a threat to you too, because it will cause your friends like Jordan to fall.
Well, first of all, I agree that ISIL is ultimately a threat to us, even though it's interesting to note we're not at the top of their hit list. It's Shias, it's other Sunnis, it's Arab states, and they've made that point. It's quite interesting that they've made that point. Let me begin with the intervention against Daesh, because I do have something to say here. In my eyes, and if I go back to the role you assigned me and try to represent the official point of view, but I think I'm speaking for most Israelis who follow the matters closely. The U.S. intervention is very perplexing, okay? A president who backed down from intervening against Assad in Syria because of public opinion, or because he's risk-averse. 2 Americans are beheaded, and in he goes in a kind of dynamic that, in my view, is almost certain to involve boots on the ground in order for anything to move. I'm very troubled by the administration's insistence on keeping Iraq whole, okay? Resisting Kurdish independence, working with Iran to prop up the Shiite-dominated central government in Baghdad, trying to want to rejuvenate an army that the U.S. trained and failed. It completely failed in, as if you do it again, it will somehow succeed this time. And all this facilitating Iran's ongoing access to the Levant via its friends in Baghdad and in Damascus, and ultimately all the way to southern Lebanon, to Hezbollah, and to the shores of the Mediterranean. This, leaving aside the nuclear issue, which is you can't really do, but just for the sake of argument, this is very perplexing. And you,
yeah, but Obama would say he's not doing that. He would say that by supporting this new government in Iraq, he's supporting a pluralist government and re-empowering the Sunnis. That's what he would say. I'm not saying it's that effective. He would say that the boots on the ground are not going to be U.S. boots, they're going to be moderate Sunni boots because of the change dynamic, and no, he's not working with Iran.
But we've been there before, this exact scenario. You may recall that in July, Prime Minister Netanyahu, early in the war against Hamas, in the course of a speech, publicly welcomed Kurdish independence. I don't know if any of you recall that statement. And a statement not solicited by the Kurds, it didn't make them happy, it made them uncomfortable. Even though our alliance goes, our good relationship goes back many decades. But I think what he was saying at the time was, if the U.S. insists that Kurdistan not be independent because it has to be part of a unified Iraq, this is not good for Israeli interests because of the Iran factor primarily, not just because we'd like to see an independent Kurdistan. And I assume he made this clearer to Obama in direct conversations. And we know that there are people like Vice President Biden who have talked about a more decentralized Iraq. And from the Israeli standpoint, that makes more sense. So here you go back to President Obama saying, well, we don't have a strategy yet, which was a misbegotten statement, but a brave one. Because so many of us don't really have viable strategies. But my sense is there's still no viable strategy. There's still no clear understanding of what can be done, what has to be done, and what the overall interests are, not just of Israel, but of some of our neighbors as well. So this is what leaves us uncomfortable in the deserts of Iraq and Syria. In many ways, from the Israeli standpoint, decentralization, weakness, ongoing warfare make more sense than a strong Iran-backed Syria. And who knows what, had Iraq stayed stable under Shiite rule, where Iran would have taken that. But we are, and I go back to my urgent issues. Iran is at our borders with 1,000 rockets. Sorry, 100,000 rockets. We just went through a war with an enemy with only 10,000 rockets, and that took 2 months to figure out, okay? This is seriously preoccupying us. Hezbollah doesn't move without Iran. And Iran doesn't move without looking at the broad situation in Iraq, Daesh, Syria, Turkey, the whole a can of worms, and it is a can of worms, and I fully sympathize with anybody who can't quite figure out how to come up with a rational strategy from all of this, but you have to try harder.
And you think, I'm sorry, just the last part of my question, supporting authoritarian governments in the region, which Israel is now doing, especially Egypt, is going to create a dynamic, an impression in young people who are deciding which side to be on that will reduce the threat or not?
Permit me on this issue not to think. And I'll tell you what, no, I'll tell you why. Because on the one hand, we have admirably avoided interfering in any way, shape, or form. Nobody can accuse us of this from the beginnings in Tahrir Square and on into Syria and so on and so forth. But we are small. We see ourselves surrounded by a growing collection of militant Islamists, and you have to forgive us if we make short-term calculations as to what can keep peace and quiet, what can prevent this spilling over our borders. And we just saw with Hamas that we didn't succeed, despite our cooperation with Egypt. Do I think that Sisi's good for Arab youth? No, no. But permit me not to think about this, because I'm not going to get involved anyway. And if the U.S. seeks to get involved, okay, I wish it success. But all I can do is go to it and say, look, you made things worse by pushing out Mubarak. All right? Our narrative, the Saudi narrative, the Jordanian narrative. You made things worse by pushing out Mubarak. You made things worse by trying to get cozy with Morsi. You made things worse by refusing to welcome Sisi. You haven't made things better. You have to at least reassess that, given the fact that, yes, ultimately we all are going to have to come to terms with a political role for Islam and with the huge youth demographic revolution in the Middle East and the fact that it's totally unanswered by circumstances.
Yes, Amal Mudalali.
Amal Mudallil, Wilson Center. I want to ask you about one of the urgent points that you talked about, the Yemen and the Houthi takeover of Yemen and basically Bab al-Mandab and the threat that Iran causes now in that region, which has effects on the Suez Canal and the region. Could you please tell us why it's so important for Israel, what kind of strategic threat it is, and what are you doing about it? Thank you.
That's a great question. I'll try not to talk too long. Haleh, in introducing me, mentioned that I'm the author of a forthcoming book, Israel, a Periphery, Israel's Search for Middle East Allies, which goes back to the Israeli periphery doctrine of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. This is one of the paradoxical aspects today, when, among other things, we were involved in supporting the Houthis, then known as Zaidis, then known as royalists, in Yemen, who were fighting against a so-called Republican revolution backed by Nasser and the Soviets. And we were recruited into this by the British, by remnants of the British SAS from World War II, in a deniable operation, which in my view was our most successful periphery operation, because through 14 airdrops of weaponry to the Zaidis, the Houthis, who were then supported by the Saudis. They weren't called Shiites. Iran wasn't around. We basically pinned down a third of the Egyptian army and made it much easier to win the Six-Day War. So that's our background. Now, what was our interest then, and what is it now? After all, to fly from Israel to Yemen and back without refueling is a 14-hour flight. It's a long way, okay? Our interest was Bab al-Mandeb. And the fear then that Nasser would take control of Bab al-Mandeb, and just as he tried to choke us at the Straits of Hormuz, not of Hormuz, sorry, the Tiran Straits in Sinai, that this would be another choke point. So we invested quite a bit in this. Now, the context is much broader, because in Saudi eyes, these are the same Iranians they see in Bahrain, the same Iranians they see in Iraq and in Syria. Now they see them on a different front in Yemen. In our eyes, it's again, broadly speaking, Bab al-Mandeb and the fear that Iran will somehow get a grip there as part of its broader Middle East deployment. I don't know of any Israeli involvement, and it's largely a Saudi problem, but I would, if you like, commend to you Yemen as what until now was a civil war, as a new front for both Shiite-Sunni confrontation, but also Arab-Iranian confrontation. I doubt you'll see Israeli-Iranian confrontation there, but Israel has a very serious interest in it, and one that coincides with the Saudi interest, and in this case, the Egyptian interest as well.
Yossi, thank you. Yes.
My name is Stephen Shore. Do you think Iran has a strategy in relation to Israel?
I believe that the regime in Iran has had a strategy, a strongly anti-Israel strategy since it came into existence. Just listen to them. They openly seek if not the destruction of Israel, the different nuances, at least the end of Israel as a Jewish state. Is this the highest item on their strategic order of priorities? Absolutely not. They seek sway among their neighbors. They certainly seek to expand their influence and the use of Shiites in various places in the Middle East, not necessarily in the Israeli context, Bahrain or Yemen. But we are clearly on their agenda, and this explains to some extent the alliance with Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and the buildup of what can only be termed a quite impressive deterrent against Israel, but one that could also just be used to aggress Israel as well. Has Israel made mistakes with regard to Iran? Without a doubt. I would say our primary mistake since the revolution of '79 has been what I call periphery nostalgia. That is, you have prominent Israelis who somehow think if we just tweak Tehran the right way, the regime will collapse, or there are potentially pro-Israeli elements there, and so somehow the course of history can be reversed. I don't see that. I see this regime as being relatively stable, long-lasting, with a fairly clear sense of what its regional strategic priorities are. One of them is Israel. They're not going to give this up easily. The question is how much, leaving aside the nuclear issue, what sort of resources we can and should devote to this in our overall list of security priorities.
Yossi, thank you, and please join me in thanking Yossi for an outstanding presentation. That was fabulous.